Hello and welcome to Walt Disney, an American original brought to you by Dear Disney. Chapter 19. After a quarter century as a producer of animated cartoons, Walt Disney in the early 1950s demonstrated his versatility with a wide variety of films. He applied the same principles he had used as a cartoon maker, preparing the stories thoroughly, create interesting characters, above all, make it real. Make it read. Nothing ambiguous, nothing uncertain. Walt even carried over the methods of animation. All of the live action films were prepared on storyboards, with each scene, each camera angle sketched on paper before anything was put on film. Thus, Walt could perceive the pacing of the movie, juxtaposing action sequences with exposition to maintain audience interest while furthering the plot. Walt's modus operandi had changed little from the days when he had only cartoon shorts to supervise. He once described his function in a homily story. My role? I was stumped one day when a little boy asked, "Do you draw, Mickey Mouse?" I had to admit that I do not draw anymore. "Then do you think up all the jokes and ideas?" "No," I said, "I don't do that." Finally, he looked at me and said, "Mr. Dizzy, just what do you do?" "Well," I said, "sometimes I think of myself as a little bee. I go from one area of the studio to another and gather pollen and sort of stimulate everybody. I guess that's the job I do." He continued his phantom tours of the studio on weekends. "I go over and just float around in my leisure when I have no pressure on me," he said. "I sit down and I look at story sketches and things. The boys know that I do that, and the boys pull all kinds of tricks to find out whether I've been there. They arrange papers in a certain way on the chairs, and when they arrive in the morning, they say, 'Well, Walt wasn't in this weekend,' but they don't know that I put the papers right back where they were." There was no waste motion in Walt's operations. He rarely indulged in small talk before a conference. When he strode into the room, discussion began immediately. When the meeting was over, he left as swift as he entered, without goodbyes. Since he dealt so often with intangibles, his instructions and story meanings could be imprecise, and veteran studio hands endeavored to fathom Walt's thinking. Said Wilfred Jackson, "In a conference room, he'd make a passing remark about something, and I'd forget about it. Later, when we looked at the material in the sweatbox, he'd complain. Why wasn't that in? We discussed it, didn't we? The big part of my career was to decide when Walt meant it and when he didn't mean it. I could never tell when he was just trying to get me to think. 'Don't do something just because I told you,' he'd say." Once Walt had described a fight sequence for a Mickey Mouse short, acting out all the parts. Jackson was confident that he could capture what Walt wanted, but when Walt saw the animation, he complained, "You've got the tail all wrong. Look, Mickey's mad all over. His tail is tense, not a limp thing hanging there. What's the matter, Jack? Didn't we talk this over?" Walt's contributions to the live-action scripts took a different form. He no longer needed to propound the appearance and action of each character. The actors would supply their own appearances and actions. He concerned himself primarily with story construction, dialogue, and the staging of scenes. At the beginning of a story conference, producers and writers recognized they had failed when Walt handed over the script with a comment, "Well, I read this thing," then turned to another topic of conversation. More often, he sat down at the low square table in his conference room and began analyzing the script's merits and defects. He had usually done his homework the night before, marking changes and suggestions in a red or blue pencil. Sometimes his contributions were specific. He would compose 2 or 3 pages of dialogue to improve the timing and sense of a scene. Often, he suggested general things. "This scene isn't playing. I believe in leaving something to the audience imagination, but you're making them play every climax off camera. The picture starts too slowly. Jump to page 4 and begin there." His suggestions were not final. He was willing to listen to arguments from the producer and writer, but there were 2 things he disliked: being interrupted when he was in the midst of interpreting a scene, and having someone argue a point that he had rejected at a previous meeting. Walt had an instinct for recognizing when a film project was not going well. Sometimes there are stories that defied solution and he simply dropped them. Months, perhaps years later, he picked up the projects and started all over again. By this time, his creative subconscious may have provided a solution. Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan were examples of films with long stories. A Hiawatha feature was another. It metamorphosized over a period of 20 years, and when a story man lacked an assignment, Walt instructed, "Put him on Hiawatha." But despite all the efforts, Hiawatha was never produced. Lady and the Tramp dated back to 1937 when Walt started working on a story about a sedate Cocker Spaniel. Then he read a short story, Happy Dan the Whistling Dog, by Ward Green, an editor for King Features, distributor for the Disney comic strips. Happy Dan was a free soul, a mutt, with loyalty to no man. Walt told Green, "Your dog and my dog have got to get together." Green agreed, and in 1943 he wrote a story called Happy Dan, the Whistling Dog, and Miss Patsy, the Beautiful Spaniel. Walt started developing a script, then dropped the project, revived it almost a decade later. He insisted on calling it Lady and the Tramp over the opposition of Green and RKO's salesman. "That's what it's about, a lady and a tramp," Walt declared. After the constrictions of dealing with two classics, Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, Walt felt comfortable with a subject that he could mold to his own patterns. He was at his dramatic best in his story meaning about the scene in which the tramp kills a rat that is menacing the baby at Lady's house. Lady's barking, trying to get Jim's attention. Then you see the light coming. His shadow's coming up. She's waiting when the door opens. She barks, starts up the stairs. He tries to grab her, says, "Girl, what's the matter?" Jim Deere chains Lady to a doghouse outside in the rain because of her barking. She has got to get Tramp's attention instead. She says, "A rat!" Tramp says, "Where?" She says, "Upstairs in the baby's room." He says, "How do you get in there?" She says, "The little door in the back." He runs right through the door in the back. It's quick, short things. He's going right in there. We have the guy cautiously coming up the stairs. Remember, he's an intruder. He doesn't know which door it is. Then he picks up the scent and he comes in the room and there's the baby's crib. We get suspense for a moment. The baby's crib, and it's dark. He starts looking around the room, and suddenly he sees two eyes glowing over there. He begins to growl, and his hair bristles. Then you see the form move, and he runs over there. It has to be like a couple of guys fighting in the dark, not knowing where the other guy is. A hell of a realistic fight there. We can do it in the shadows from the window and onto it. Shadow forms against silhouette forms against light. Certain lighting effects will make it very effective. You actually want to put on a thing like he's a damn good ratter. The rat, of course, always faces him. When the rat moves, he goes, grabs it, gets him, throws him. A nervous thing. When the rat goes over, he won't go after it. One thing about a ratter, he'll never attack when a rat or a mole is on its back. He waits for the thing to get on its feet, to go, and he grabs at the back of the neck. The dog, that's not a ratter, will just bite him in the stomach. The rat will come up and go through the cheek with his teeth. The rat gets a death grip on the dog's cheek. Walt produced two more adventure films in England, The Sword and the Rose and Rob Roy. He contemplated two other projects to film at the studio, Jules Verne's classic adventure 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The Great Locomotive Chase, based on an incident during the Civil War. Both had special appeal for Walt, the first for Verne's remarkable anticipation of submarines, atomic power, and self-contained underwater suits, the second for its Civil War lore and the chance for him to play with full-size trains. Harper Goff was assigned to create story sketches for both projects, and Walt presented them to a group of visiting theater executives. They decided in favor of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and their preference helped Walt decide to go forward with it. The production would be expensive, Walt realized. It would require construction of a new stage with a huge tank for underwater filming, important stars for the four leading roles, locations in the Caribbean where water was clear enough for filming, costly effect photography with storms and a monstrous squid, and expensive sets, including the submarine Nautilus itself. Because of the call, Walt was hesitant about mentioning the 20,000 Leagues project to his brother. Later, Walt commented about Roy's surprised reaction. "I first told him it was going to cost $3 million with all he had to do. It wasn't contested, and as time went on, I went down to see him. I'd say, 'Looks like that thing's going to run $3,300,000. He just nodded and smiled, and then as I kept going along, we got to where it was $3,800,000. He'd still nod and smile, and finally got to $4,200,000. He was still smiling. It was the first time he ever did that on a picture. For some reason, he believed in it from the very start. I got worried then. I thought there was something wrong with him, but he just had faith and confidence in it." A special kind of director was needed for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the studio's most ambitious product. Walt and his staff viewed the movies of numerous directors before the choice was narrowed to 3. Films of each were screened, and Walt asked his staff members to vote on a selection. All selected Richard Fleischer. "That's fine," Walt commented, "because I've already picked him." Fleischer came to the studio, and Walt made the offer for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. "Do you know who my father is?" the director asked. Walt smiled and said he did. "I cannot direct the picture unless he gives his permission," Fleischer said. "I know he will have strong feelings about it, and I must abide by his decision." "You're absolutely right," Walt said. "Go ahead and ask him." The director's father was Max Fleischer, the pioneering cartoon maker. During his youth, Richard Fleischer had often heard his father inveigh against Walt Disney for borrowing techniques and raiding the Fleischer studio for animators, although Fleischer in turn lured away Disney personnel when he opened an animated studio in Florida. Max Fleischer had sought to make the first sound cartoon, and later the first cartoon feature. Both times, his releasing company, Paramount, refused approval, and Walt Disney accomplished the innovations. When Richard Fleischer asked if he should go to work for his father's arch rival, Max Fleischer replied, "Of course you should, and tell Walt that I think his judgment is very good." For a year, Walt worked with Fleischer and the screenwriter Earl Felton in developing the script of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Harper Goff designed a Nautilus to fit Jules Verne's description of a submarine disguised as a sea monster. The interior, devised by John Meehan, was decorated in lush Victorian style, with velvet-colored furniture and a pipe organ. For the first time, Disney hired important Hollywood stars. James Mason as Captain Nemo, Kirk Douglas as harpooner Ned Land, Paul Lucas as the gentle scientist and Professor Aronnax, and Peter Lorre as his assistant Conseil. Filming began in the clear Caribbean waters near Nassau, then shifted to Jamaica for the Cannibal Island sequence. The company returned to the studio to begin shooting the fight with the giant squid on the newly completed Stage 3 with its 90 by 165-foot tank. As Walt watched the rushes, he realized the scene wasn't working. It was being filmed on a flat sea at sunset. The studio technicians had constructed a realistic squid, but it became unwieldy when the kapok and its tentacles soaked up water. After a few days of shooting, Walt visited the set and told Fleischer, "I want you to start on the dramatic scenes and postpone the squid fight until later. This stuff is awful." The director agreed. "It's phony as a $3 bill, the wires are showing, and there's no illusion at all." Production shifted to another stage for interior scenes with the principal actors. Walt put his technicians to work on a more maneuverable and convincing squid. They produced a 2-ton beast with 80 40-foot tentacles and 2 feelers 50 feet long. 28 men were required to animate the squid with hydraulics, compressing air, and electronics. With hideous yellow eyes and a snapping beak, it presented a fearsome menace for Nemo and his submariners. To add to the horror, the squid attack was filmed not in the pink calm of sunset, but in a howling storm. Tons of water hurtled down on the tank, wind machines whipping the spray, and arc lamps sent lightning flashes through the dark. The sequence required 8 days to film and added more than $250,000 to the budget. The increased cost strained Roy Disney's warm feelings towards 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and tried the bankers' patience with Walt's spendings. He was required to show them the early footage from the film before they would agree to lend him more money. The added expense was a worthwhile investment. The squid fight proved to be the visual highlight of the film. The success of the true-life adventure films prompted naturalists to submit movies to the Disney studio. One of the offerings was a 10 minutes of desert film made as part of a doctoral thesis by N. Paul Kenworthy Jr., a student at the University of California at Los Angeles. He had painstakingly photographed a sequence in which a wasp stung a tarantula into paralysis and laid its eggs inside the spider's body. When the young wasp hatched, they fed upon the preserved body of the tarantula, then flew off. "This is good stuff," Walt said enthusiastically when reviewing the film. "Let's go to hold of this young man and set him up out in the desert and see if he can come up with other good stories. We could build the whole thing around the desert." Kenworthy and a colleague, Robert H. Crandall, spent months in the desert filming animal life, and the studio solicited films from other natural photographers. They produced exciting sequences: a family of peccaries treeing a bobcat, a kangaroo rat protecting its young by kicking sand at a sidewinder, a red-tailed hawk, and a death battle with a rattlesnake. Walt viewed the footage and told his producer, Ben Sharpstein, "This is a feature. This is where we can tell a real, sustained story for the first time in these nature pictures." Jim Auger directed The Living Desert and wrote the narration with Ted Sears and Winston Hibler, who'd been the voice of the true-life adventures from the beginning. As with other films, the talk was minimal. The Disney philosophy likened narration to rolling a hoop with a stick. If the film was well edited, the hoop needed only an occasional hit to keep it rolling. Predictably, RKO salesmen were opposed to the idea of selling a full-length documentary to theaters, and their reluctance added to the Disney's growing discontent with the distribution company. The sales force was tough and thorough, and the contract terms were favorable, but RKO began to decline in morale and efficiency after Howard Hughes bought control of the company in 1948. Hughes, tired of running the film company, and offered to give it right to the Disneys, along with a $10 million bank credit line. But there was a catch. RKO had incurred heavy liabilities during its decline. After a meeting with Hughes to discuss the offer, Walt told Roy, "We've already got a studio. Why do we need another one?" With The Living Desert nearly completion, Roy realized that RKO had neither the enthusiasm nor the know-how to sell such an attraction. He established a small sales organization called Buena Vista after the street where the studio was located. The Living Desert was first booked into the Sutton Theater in New York, along with a cartoon feature at Ben and Me. It was an immediate success, and Buena Vista added more salesmen and released The Living Desert in a careful, deliberate way throughout the country. Proportionally, it became the biggest profit maker in Disney's history, earning $4 million after a production cost of $300,000. Howard Hughes' neglect of RKO had caused the company to deteriorate rapidly, and Roy decided to seek another distributor for the studio's product. He and Card Walker went to New York for discussions with the major film companies, and the results were discouraging. Although the companies were eager to have the prestige of the Disney name, their terms seemed excessive. Roy recognized the drawbacks of releasing through a major company. The distributor naturally favored its own studio's products, giving less favorable play dates to independent producers. Roy summoned the key salesman of Buena Vista and told him they had proved with Living Desert that they could distribute a film successfully. Roy pointed out that the company had two attractions of great promise: 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Lady and the Tramp. Now, if you have the guts and the vision are willing to work, do you want to go forward with our own distribution company? Roy asked. The salesman readily agreed, and thereafter the Disney films were distributed by Buena Vista. While The Living Desert proved an immense success for the public, some reviewers and intellectual journals criticized its anthropomorphism. This was part of a growing trend as the Disney product became more popular and more diverse. The same kind of critic who had embraced the Disney cartoons in the 1930s began to attack Disney films as sentimentalized and corny. Walt was at first perplexed, then hurt by the critics, some of which seemed more political in nature. One evening, as a studio nurse was applying the heat treatment to Walt's neck, he grumbled about a bad review the New Yorker had given a Disney film. Hazel George answered, "Why would you care what those urban hicks say?" "What did you call them?" Walt asked. "Urban hicks." Walt laughed with delight and said admirably to Hazel, "That's what an education will do for you." Thank you again for your time. Your time is very important to me and to everyone at Dear Disney. Until next time, remember, today's special moments make tomorrow's memories.